Today we're going to be watching the 1946 Department of War film called A Tale of Two Cities about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I'm planning to do a live stream like this every Friday, at least for the next several weeks. And as I can continue to find more movies to watch, I'm going to keep going and keep trying to do this every Friday at 3 o'clock. Okay, so it looks like it's 3 o'clock. So we're going to get started with A Tale of Two Cities from the War Department. So here we go.
This tale of two cities of a desert morning. Atomic age is born. A scientific thunderbolt gives a preview of its destructive force.
This test was called Trinity. They built 3 bombs in the Manhattan Project, and this is the first one. They tested it in New Mexico. July 16th, 1945.
From the instant of that first blast until Hiroshima vanished from the list of living cities, closely guarded plants in New Mexico, Tennessee, and the state of Washington continued their work to shorten the war.
Everything we're seeing here is actually part of the Manhattan Project, which was the most secret project of the entire World War II. They planted entire towns like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is what we're seeing here. That's Oak Ridge National Laboratories. It's a town of like 30,000 people that they literally planted in the middle of Tennessee like a flower, just to be able to have a secret place that nobody else knew about in order to produce the nuclear material that the Manhattan Project knew that they were going to need in order to create the bomb. So that's actually what we're looking at right here on screen is Oak Ridge in Tennessee.
Hiroshima, one of Japan's arsenal cities, was selected as the first to feel the weight of atomic power.
Plane's called the Enola Gay. It was named after the pilot's mother.
21 days after the New Mexico dress rehearsal, a lone B-29 was over Hiroshima carrying an atomic bomb. At 8:15 in the morning of August 6th, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target. The bomb was aimed to explode above 0 point, a spot in the city at the junction of the Motoisu and Ota rivers. The bomb was intentionally set to explode well above the 0 point to dissipate its radioactivity. Here is the pictorial record of the result. At 0 point, directly beneath the explosion, the soldier in the scene is pointing at the spot from which all damage to the surrounding area was measured in terms of distance from the center of the blast.
So this guy's actually standing at ground zero. The Hiroshima bomb was detonated above ground so that it spread out a lot of energy and knocked down the city. This city was about the size of Cleveland, Ohio. And this one bomb then leveled the entire city. You can see in the wide shots how very little is left of the actual city of Hiroshima after the bomb goes off. It's really absolute total destruction. And again, he's standing literally underneath the point at which the bomb was detonated. So you can tell that just from that one individual bomb, it's a humongous destructive capacity.
Within a mile of 0 point,
just as far as you can see, there's just nothing left. It knocked everything over and set everything on fire.
But in these very ruins, Army cameramen have found and filmed pictorial evidence that tells in twisted steel and stone the effect of death-dealing atomic power. For example, this was the site of the main Japanese military headquarters. There were approximately 20,000 Japanese military personnel stationed here.
You can see the outline there of the foundation of that building. The main Japanese Army headquarters there had about 30,000 soldiers in it. All of them were vaporized when the bomb went off. When the bomb went off, it actually ignited the oxygen in the atmosphere and created a firestorm, and that burned up a lot of things, which is why they didn't find a lot of the things that were incinerated in the bombing. And so you can actually see there the foundation of the building, but again, none of the 30,000 people that were inside that building when it was detonated by the bomb were ever located.
They are among the missing. A lone concrete smokestack indicates where a bustling factory once stood. reinforced concrete buildings seem to have withstood the explosion fairly well, the damage varying with their distance from 0 point. Within an area of 1 mile to 1.5 miles, this type of building was the only type to withstand complete demolition and destruction.
So from the 0 point, from the place where that bomb went off, for 1 mile to 1.5 miles in a circle, all the way around that, absolutely everything that wasn't reinforced concrete was just completely and totally obliterated. Most of it was vaporized. You can see all the rubble laying around. If buildings were reinforced concrete and relatively new buildings, then they stood up a little bit better, but we'll see here in a little bit exactly that not even reinforced concrete buildings withstood the force of the blast. And again, that's up to 1.5 miles away. That's an incredibly destructive force from a single bombing, right? You see things like this from carpet bombing, and you know, we talked about carpet bombing and things like the Spanish Civil War, but this from one individual bomb, 1.5 miles around 0 point, is just absolutely totally destructive.
Here's a building that was actually knocked sidewise, giving you an idea of the force of the blast. The direction of the blast is graphically told by the slant of this parapet.
So you can kind of see there in the corner, this is the corner of a building, and again, it's a reinforced concrete building. The one wall actually had so much blast force coming down in it that it actually knocked the wall out and away from the rest of the building. If you look at the stairs there, you can actually see where they were lifted up and the entire wall was separated. It's called a parapet, but the whole wall was just separated and disintegrated from the rest of the building.
A concrete wall.
That's from the outside of the same building.
Etched in the stone base of what was the Russo-Japanese War Memorial are telltale lines. Atomic hand.
Here you can see it's really kind of interesting. This is a marble war memorial for the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 when the Japanese and the Russians went to war with each other, which hopefully some of you guys remember, right? President Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the peace between those two nations. When an atomic bomb goes off, there's 3 things that happen that make it go off. There's fire, or flash, is the first effect of an atomic bomb. The second effect of an atomic, and so that burns things up, right? The second effect of an atomic bomb is blast, or pressure. That pressure actually compresses the air and it moves as a wave through the air, and that's one of the reasons why you'll get, explosive forces generating, just the destruction of buildings. The third thing that makes an atomic bomb different than any other bomb, right? Because all other bombs work that way. They have blast and they have flash. The third effect, though, is radiation. And so what you'll see is helium nuclei, right, where you'll get protons and subatomic particles that'll just come flying out of the nuclear fission going on inside of that bomb. And so you've got all these very, very, very tiny particles that are coming out in enormous quantities, and it's basically like a bead blaster, or like blowing sand up against this marble war memorial. And so despite the fact that it's made out of marble, you can see there on the corner where there's a light side and there's a dark side. The dark side is where over time it accumulated a lot of dirt and crud and just being exposed to the elements, whereas the flying particles coming off of the atomic bomb itself actually polished all of that marble that was actually exposed to the blast. So you can see the particles actually wrap around the corner there, but the dirty part is where it was not exposed to the flying particles of the atomic bomb, and the plain white clean part is where it was exposed to the flying particles of the radiation of the bomb.
For all to read. Another signpost of the direction and force of the explosion is blasted in the polished granite base of this statue. The light surface indicates the angle of the blast. 0.2 of a mile.
You can see the same thing there, with the dirty and the clean side.
Many of the shattered windows pointed like skeleton fingers the direction of the atomic wind of death.
Right, so this is when the pressure wave comes through, it pushes in all of the windows on the one side of the building, and then on the other side of the building,
on the other,
that pressure wave continues through the building and blows the windows out on the other side.
Inside, the flash burns on the chairs give eloquent testimony on the heat of the blast 1 mile from 0 point.
So this is actually 1 mile away from where the bomb goes off, and these chairs were sitting next to a window, and the wall would block those flying particles. It would block the radiation from getting in, but the window obviously wouldn't, because light goes through a window. And so you can see where these chairs were sitting next to the window, those flying particles came in and actually scorched the cloth upholstery on the top of these things. So even if you're, and this is again from 1 mile away from where the bomb actually goes off, so the effects of this atomic bomb are absolutely incalculable when it comes to comparing it to a conventional bomb.
The mohair upholstery like a blowtorch. Hiroshima City Hall, which stood at an angle of 45 degrees to the direction of the explosion, had its doors and windows blown in, but suffered much less damage than buildings squarely in the path of the blast. The windows and doors offer mute evidence of the way the blast swept into the structures. The destructive circle within a mile from 0 point had a few notable exceptions, mainly reinforced concrete. On the edge of the area of greatest damage was a landmark, the Red Cross Hospital, which never ceased functioning, although it sustained damage. Today, it dominates the desert of a debris that was Hiroshima. Another notable exception to the general demolition was the Nagasaki Railroad Station in East Hiroshima, a mile and a half from the center of the blast. This building, however, suffered extensive damage. The twisted steel beams and concrete walls show the effects of the tremendous concussion.
And again, all of this is a mile and a half away from where the bomb itself actually went off, and still you're seeing iron girder work and steel being just twisted and snapped because of the enormous pressure wave.
What's left of the Commercial Museum, within 2/10 of a mile of 0 point, also gives indication of the tremendous push of the explosion. The downward force of the blast turned the roof of the Commercial Museum into a reservoir.
Looks like a swimming pool on top of that, from where the
Amazingly enough, bridges did not suffer too badly at Hiroshima. This steel rail bridge, 1 mile from 0 point, had the side toward the explosion virtually blasted by flying particles, which removed almost all the paint.
Here we can see, so a bridge is actually an interesting thing, and they don't do too bad against an atomic bomb because, of course, they're very flat and they're very low and they don't have very much surface area on the side, so it never builds up enough pressure to normally break the bridge unless it's right underneath where the bomb goes off. But those flying particles, that radiation on the one side, it blows off all of the paint and it just scours the one side of the bridge with paint, whereas on the other side,
but the side away from the explosion
totally
did not
fine
need a new
because
paint
those
job.
flying particles are only going in one direction.
Roads in the area fared better than buildings or bridges. Shortly after the fires died down, traffic was resumed.
It's interesting that they're focusing so much on infrastructure. They're focusing on buildings and roads and bridges. And one of the things you'll hopefully notice is that they're not focusing on is casualties, right? They're not focusing on people. The estimates for the Hiroshima bomb it's about 20,000 soldiers, 20,000 members of the Japanese military were killed in the bombing, and then somewhere between 70 and 126,000 civilians were killed in the bombings. And as you'll notice, that this particular, and again, it's being created by the Ministry of War, by the Department of War. They're almost completely and totally ignoring the fact that 200,000 or 150,000 people were just vaporized. And then on top of that, the people who weren't vaporized by the bomb, of course, died in the fires or died of, significant damage from the buildings collapsing, or, there's a huge number of things. Another thing to notice is this is 1946, and so one of the things you won't see them talk a whole lot about is radiation, because at that time it still wasn't something that was widely admitted or widely understood, and they definitely didn't want to release a lot of that information to the public yet.
Today, these highways through the ruins are again in use. Beside our military traffic trudge the survivors of vanished Hiroshima, the first city in history to be atom-bombed into oblivion. Even 4 miles away, the effects of the atomic blast were felt.
Okay, so this is kind of interesting too. Hiroshima actually sits down inside of a valley, and so the valley is basically the shape of a bowl. 4 miles away, there's a little hill, and then behind that hill, there is a Catholic monastery. It's called the Novitiate of the Jesuits, and so a group of Jesuits actually maintained a presence there to try to spread Christianity to Japan after they opened up again in the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, and then further on from there. So a group of actually German, and you'll see when they interview him, German priests were actually in this novitiate of the Jesuits, but again, the fact that they were behind that little hill helped to protect them, as well as the fact that they're 4 miles away helped to protect them from the bomb's blast, but still they were able to witness this, and he's actually going to give us, he's a little hard to understand because he is super, super German, but he's going to give us actually a really interesting first-hand interview account of the bombing of Hiroshima.
Although a hill between the novitiate of the Jesuits and 0 point lessened the intensity, windows of the main building were shattered. a group of priests witnessed and survived the Hiroshima blast. One of them, Father John Zymus, tells what he actually saw. An eyewitness account.
I was in my room, which faces the valley, and suddenly I saw a light, like magnesium light, flashlight, which filled the whole valley. And looking out of my window to find out the reason for this peculiar phenomena, I saw nothing besides this light. And turning from the window to the door of my room, I heard a crash. It may have been 10 seconds after seeing the light, the flashlight.
So that's an interesting one there, right? The light gets to him almost immediately, right? The speed of light's 186,000 miles per second, and so once that bomb goes off, the light hits him immediately, which means the radiation hits him immediately too. But then, of course, he's got the opportunity to turn away from his window and start walking out of the building, or out of the room, when eventually that pressure wave, which is not moving at the speed of light, takes its time, travels that 4 miles to get to his room, and then ultimately he hears the blast, he hears the crash, and then you'll see what happens next.
And immediately I was covered with splinters of the window frames and glass sticking into the walls and actually in my flesh itself.
So I don't know if you caught that because, again, super German, but he said that the pressure wave was so high that it actually broke out the frames, the wooden frames around the windows, and actually broke the glass too, so hard that there were splinters of wood from the window frames sticking in the wall across the room and sticking in his skin after that pressure wave had gone 4 miles over a hill and then still hit the building he was standing in and just obliterated that window to the point where it was sticking inside of him from across the room.
After a while, we saw a procession of people coming from the outskirts of the city up the valley. Many of them, most of them, were wounded, especially the parts of the body which were not covered by clothes, like hands, feet, back.
So that's one of the things that people had a hard time understanding at the beginning too, and what he said was, of course, that people were walking up the valley and a lot of them had burns on their bodies, but just on the parts of their bodies that wouldn't have been covered by clothes. And so he says, their hands, their feet, their backs, things like that, because those things wouldn't have been covered by clothes. And at the time, people didn't really understand, but we know now that those burns were caused by the radiation, which, again, comes flying through the air, it hits your body, it burns your body, just like a microwave. If you think about an atomic bomb like a microwave, that's what burns a lot of people and kills a lot of people, is this microwave energy. And of course, it's not microwaves, because microwaves aren't that dangerous to us, but it's gamma rays, it's X-rays, it's really, really, really high intensity, high energy light coming through the air and then burning people's bodies.
Was to live through this experience at the spot, estimate the numbers of deaths at least as 100,000.
So even then, when they interviewed him, he estimated that it was at least 100,000 people dead in the bombing of Hiroshima. And actually, again, he's really, really close there. He would have had no way of knowing how many military personnel were there, so he couldn't really account for the 20,000 soldiers. But again, just in terms of civilians, it's between 70 and 126,000 people are estimated to have been killed in Hiroshima. So his estimate of 100,000 is actually pretty good for the fact that he was just a guy on the ground helping after the fires.
What is your opinion as to the story that the ruins of the city emit a deadly ray?
Well, I think that it's just a rumor. Because I myself and others of us have worked in the city itself immediately after the explosion for several hours, and we felt no ill effect at all.
Now that's a really interesting part too, and I've actually done about 5 hours of research to try to find out what happens to this Jesuit priest. His name is Father John Zymus. And if you couldn't hear the question, because again, the audio is not great on this because it's from 1946, but the question was, what is your opinion that the ruins of the city emit a deadly ray? So what they're asking about there is, what do you think about this whole rumor about radiation coming off of what we would call today radiation being emitted by the ruins of the city? And he says, I think that's just a rumor because me and several other people from the Jesuits, novitiate of the Jesuits, worked in the city right after the bomb went off to try to help control the fires and try to help take care of people. And we were there for several hours right after the bomb went off, and we didn't experience any ill effects at all. And I tried to do some research into what happened to John Zymus and whether he ended up, getting radiation poisoning or dying of cancer or who. I can't find anything about him at all. So if anybody out there can find out, what happened to Father John Zymus, you let me know, because it's a really interesting question. And the fact that he denies the fact that, radiation exists inside of these ruins is a really interesting one, but it also shows us why in 1945 and 1946, people were completely and totally ignorant. They had no idea what atomic bombs were, or what the consequences were, or how important this power was eventually going to be, particularly when we transition into the Cold War. So let's keep going.
After Hiroshima, Tokyo wondered when the next atom bomb would fall.
We actually have uncovered communications within the Japanese government that said that. And we found communications that said that, we're just going to weather the storm, and if they do this again, we're just going to keep going with it. We're not going to surrender. We're not going to do anything. At the same time, if you remember, the United States Air Command was dropping pamphlets over 11 Japanese cities saying, we will keep wiping your cities out until you tell your government to surrender. And of course, one of the really important parts of that is the Japanese government doesn't know we've only got one bomb left, right? We tested one in Trinity, we dropped one in Hiroshima. They don't know we've only got one left. And the other big thing here is we're trying to scare the Russians in Europe, and so we definitely don't want Stalin to know we've only got one bomb left. The hope was that after Hiroshima they were going to give up, but ultimately, when they saw those communications that said they weren't going to, 3 days later on August 9th of 1945, the decision was made that we're going to drop the last atomic bomb that we've got, and we're going to drop it on Nagasaki.
They did not wonder long, because the president delivered an ultimatum: surrender or face complete destruction. The Japanese ignored the ultimatum. It was evident that atomic power to break the enemy must become the tale of two cities. Nagasaki was selected to become target city number 2. Exactly 3 days after Hiroshima, a B-29 set out for Nagasaki. Instructions were precise. To the north, Japan's greatest torpedo plant. To the south, steel and arms works were located in the heart of the city.
So one of the questions I usually get quite a lot is, why did they bomb Nagasaki specifically? Hiroshima had a lot of industry. It had a major Japanese headquarters for the military there. That's really why they attacked that. Also, the weather over Tokyo wasn't very good that day, and they wanted to make sure that they were going to be able to get some reasonably good estimates of how good the bomb was. Nagasaki had three things that were really super important. Number one, the largest torpedo factory in Japan was in Nagasaki, and the other one was steelworks. If you take out steel, you can't make anything out of steel. So you can't make guns, you can't make ammunition, you can't make all kinds of militarily important products if you blow up steelworks. The other thing, and they're going to show this here, I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on this streaming video, but the other thing about Nagasaki is you can see the dark part there where the city is. That's where the two factories are. One's in the north and one's in the south, but the downtown part of that city is also surrounded by these hills, which they assumed was going to help prevent civilians who lived on the other side of those hills from being as hurt as they were in Hiroshima. Nagasaki is kind of a divided city. You've got the places where people live on the east side of the hills, and then you've got the downtown on the west side of the hills. So they thought that kind of a bowl shape would help to contain the destruction to the places that were really important, which is, again, the factories that are making military equipment to help kill American soldiers and Allied soldiers. If we can take out the factories and we don't have to kill the civilians as much as possible, that's one of the reasons why Nagasaki was very high on the list. And again, when the weather over Tokyo was crummy, they decided to go with Nagasaki.
The bomb was aimed midway between the two plants to cause greatest possible damage. Because the plants were located in a valley, surrounding hills shielded most residential areas.
You can see there the light part is the city, and then the dark part is on the other side of the hills.
At 10:58, the morning of August 9th, the bomb was exploded above the
That's
city.
the actual
and in the towering
detonation. You
mushroom,
can see the actual
Japan
mushroom
could
cloud.
read its doom. This was more than a routine bombing. It was the funeral pyre of an aggressor nation. The bomb had been purposely exploded high, so that the greatest part of its radioactive material was dissipated in the stratosphere.
So some of that's actually smoke from the fires and from the flash. Some of that is actually dirt and debris that when the bomb is detonated above the ground, it blows down and it vaporizes things. And then, of course, if you push out hard enough, eventually you get a suction which draws everything else back up. So a lot of the stuff you're seeing in that cloud is actually material from the ground that's being sucked up into the atmosphere, and that cloud's going to peak at about 60,000 feet in height. So again, it's a humongously destructive force that's being used here in Nagasaki. The death statistics on this one are, because it didn't have a major military headquarters, it's only about 150 soldiers accounted for that were killed in the bombing, but this one's between 39,000 and 80,000 individual citizens that were killed in the bombing. And again, a lot of that is as a result of those hills that surround the downtown, so that we were hitting their factories and not necessarily hitting their civilians as hard as we did in Hiroshima.
From the air, the skeletons of the Mitsubishi plants made evident that Nagasaki's war making.
Here you can see that's the Mitsubishi plant. That's they were making airplane engines for Japanese Zeros and kamikaze aircraft. So you can see the outline of that steel factory. And again, it's just been completely and totally obliterated. The smokestacks are still there. At least some of the smokestacks are still there. But the building and all the machinery inside is just absolutely and totally gone.
Power was totally destroyed. For the valley area of little more than 3 square miles, blast and fire reduced the industrial plants and surrounding buildings to blackened rubble.
And again, if you think about these factories, for our purposes, of course, if you think about this in terms of something like U.S. Steel in Lorain, Ohio, absolutely enormous modern industrial factories that are just completely and totally vaporized by the bomb. It's a humongous thing to do, and it's a humongous amount of energy that's being released in these bombs. And to use them in a war is, again, it's enormously destructive.
The Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works extended almost a mile in length. Before the blast, these were modern buildings constructed like our own American factories. Closer examination of the ruin shows the same complete destruction that characterized the ruins of Hiroshima. Damage to equipment and machinery used in the manufacture of naval rifles, AA guns, and heavy artillery was such that even if Japan had determined to commit suicide by continuing resistance, she could not have salvaged much from the ruins.
And one of the things I want you guys to do is I want you to remember a lot of these images that we see from the ruins and from the destruction, because not next week, but in 2 weeks, we're going to do another live stream where I'm going to watch a film called You Can Beat the A-Bomb. Which is from the Cold War, and it was an attempt to try to convince people that they were going to be okay and we could survive an atomic attack. I want you to think about these images, so when we see the way the government tries to kind of calm people down and assuage their fears and make them chill out and relax, when you see these images compared to what they're going to show you in those propaganda images in the future in the 50s, they don't really line up all that well. So keep these images in mind: the twisted steel, the obliterated buildings, that kind of stuff, because that's going to be important to us later.
Smokestacks bent but did not break before the blast. And roads were unaffected, people using them without ill effect shortly after the explosion. The ruins revealed beyond doubt the existence of the shadow factories the Japanese had set up in the nearby residential areas of the industrial valley.
So here, this is one of the justifications for bombing and using the atomic bombs too, is that one of the rules of war was that you're not supposed to hide things for the military among civilians. And so one of the things the narrator just talked about there is what they called shadow factories. So the idea behind this is, of course, the Allies are going to try to blow up your big factories into giant buildings around your cities. But if we hide those factories and we break them up into small pieces and we hide those inside of people's houses, then the Allies won't bomb civilians, because that would be a horrible, awful thing to do. And so we can keep our factories safe by hiding them among the the innocent civilians. And one of the justifications for even carpet bombing is the Japanese, and of course the Germans did some of this stuff too, is they're blending the lines between military targets and civilian targets. So when we just bomb the entire city, it's not really our fault, it's their fault. And of course a lot of this is just, the Americans feel the need to get payback for Pearl Harbor. So to some extent they needed justification. To some extent this was just the Japanese started the war, and so they get what they have coming to them.
You have seen the swath of destruction created by atomic power in this tale of two cities. The world's greatest minds in science, statecraft, and military matters are wrestling with the problems created by the atom. On this spot, outlined in stone, is a figure representing the average man, regardless of his race or creed.
So here you can see he's actually standing in the person's footprints, and when the bomb went off, that flash, that huge push of radiation that comes through and scours off all the dirt and debris from the blacktop around him. One of the problems is if you're standing there, you're actually going to cast a shadow because your body will absorb some of that radiation and before you're killed, and so it actually casts a shadow, and you can see that light colored shadow behind him where a person was actually walking on this bridge when the bomb went off, and their body blocked enough of that radiation that it actually cast their impression there. You can see this, and if you Google this, you can see different examples of where you'll see people's shadows cast on walls and into cement, into concrete and things like that. So you have to keep in mind that was a human being standing there when that bomb went off, and that's what's left behind in the kind of memorialization of this person who was vaporized by this bomb.
These atomic footprints on the sands of time can never be erased. They point a path which leads to unparalleled progress or unparalleled destruction. Just as in the darkness of the desert morning when the atomic age was born, atomic power puts the question squarely to mankind.
So one of the reasons why I think this is really important is, first of all, of course, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki end the war, because, of course, the Japanese surrender a few days later. Beyond that, though, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki also scare Stalin, and it helps to really start the Cold War. The problem is in 1945, people don't really understand what atomic bombs look like. They say, oh, thank goodness the Japanese surrendered. But once they start getting films like this, once they start getting images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they go, oh my goodness, this is really bad, and this is a whole different kind of war. One of the things I at least want to acknowledge is, between 129 and 226,000 people were killed in these bombings, and that's horrible. That's absolutely atrocious that had to happen, but of course that happened, and whether it's good or bad, it happened, and that's what we have to stick to, is the fact that it happened. But beyond that, what we also have to focus on is when people realize that the next war, right? We had World War I, which produced World War II. If we're going to have a World War III, and it's going to be an atomic war, when people start seeing images like what's coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they realize that even in the United States, we're not safe anymore. There's no place to hide, and this next war is going to be really, really, really bad. So they start focusing much more on things like international peace efforts. That's one of the reasons why the United Nations had such a huge push to try to make it work compared to the League of Nations, which did not work. But this is also why in 1949, when the Soviet Union develops the atomic bomb, the Cold War becomes something that really, really, really scares a lot of people. So I hope this video was good for you guys. I hope that you enjoyed watching A Tale of Two Cities. I hope it was informative. I hope it gives you a little bit more information about the end of World War II. And again, I hope it's going to help bridge the gap as we start moving here into the Cold War. Next Friday at 3 o'clock, my plan is we're going to watch a little bit of anti-communist propaganda. The film is actually called Make Mine Freedom, and it's all about ism, which is communism. So I hope to see you guys back here at 3 o'clock sharp next Friday. May 1st. Of course, leave comments and questions in the comment section down below. Shoot me an email. Drop a question onto Google Classroom if you'd like to. Drop a like if you liked it. And make sure you subscribe so that you get all the new notifications for both the new videos and the new live streams. So thanks a lot for showing up, everybody, and I will see you in the next video and the next live stream.